Let me start by inviting Professor Martin Paus to make his opening remarks. I don't have time here to tell everyone about how distinguished your areas of study are, but I'm particularly interested in your issue around the sort of whole question of the morality issue of culture embedded in the Chinese system as well. So over to you, Professor Paus.
Yes, I think very few people understand how profound was China's impact on the Enlightenment and some of these ideas we think of as modern Western ideas. Many Enlightenment scholars regard secular morality as one of its key insights, and this owes a good deal to China. As you know, the problem with situating authority in religion is that it's essentially unchecked. The aristocracy, the king can do whatever they want because God won't come down and contradict them. So in the 17th century, European philosophers were reading translations of Chinese, of the Confucian books, basically. And they said, well, oh, this is very good moral thinking, but there's no religion and no religious wars. Let's learn from that. And as you know, Jefferson and Madison and others embraced this idea of separating church and state. But if the chief executive isn't making these decisions about government, then who should do it? And in China, the idea of Wu Wei was very important. This Daoist idea that the chief executive keeps his hands off, basically, and lets the experts run the government. So you need some, but then how do you choose the experts? Well, I think one of China's most brilliant insights really was what I call the tally model. In Chinese, it's based on the metaphor of a tally, 名实相符. So basically, authority is when you have a match between the officer's charge and the officer's performance. And here's also where public and private come in. As long as the officer is carrying out his charge and then he's benefiting the public, or she's benefiting the public. If they use their office for personal benefit, then that is corruption. This whole notion of corruption was introduced to England via Chinese texts. And so let's say you're the head of the EPA, you need to know about science, you need to know about environmental science. But in addition, as Dr. Yang was saying, you need virtue. Well, what that word "de" means in Chinese from ancient times onwards is dedication to the public interest. So every official had to have expertise and dedication to the public interest. Without both of those, they weren't carrying out their charge, and so they wouldn't have authority. The authority is not in the person. This is also the root of checks, because the check derives from the fact that those two have to match. Now, the Chinese system of checks, the 6 ministries, and the checks worked up and down and sideways. All this was introduced in the early 18th century, 15 years before Montesquieu. Montesquieu talks about checks and balances and the separation of powers about 16, 17 years later. He reduced the 6 to 3, but in my view, he missed the most important point. He did not realize that the authority actually is in the office, it's not in the person. And so what we have in the modern world sometimes is an inability to recognize the conflict of interest, particularly in populist regimes, or when a democratic government turns populist. Then authority is imagined as a kind of something that's transferred directly from the people to the candidate without a specific charge. Okay, it's just authority. And then the candidate can do whatever she wants with it. And then it becomes very difficult, even if the officer, for example, uses public office for private benefit or otherwise violates the charge. I think the public has a tendency to think, oh, but he has this title or she has this title. She's the governor, so we can't get rid of her. But in the Chinese view, this was much less of a problem. There are many cases in Chinese history where an official violates the charge, and the investigating officer says, well, when you did this, you acted in your private capacity. you weren't acting as an officer because your office doesn't allow you to do that. And so this is a crime, and we can get rid of you. I think that this conception, this understanding, along with the understanding of virtue as dedication to the public interest, not just not drinking or whatever, this possibly could help in the context of the current world. Let me just say one more thing. I'll make it brief. It wasn't just the notion of meritocracy that was learned from reading Chinese texts. Thomas Jefferson, for example, had over 100 translated Chinese policy documents, which repeat over and over all those things I just said. But even the terms. So when we use the term, say, talent or ability and virtue, where virtue means dedication to the public interest, those were 18th century translations of the Chinese terms 才德, because I've looked at the Chinese and the translation, and you can see that those terms were translated into virtue and merit and virtue in the 18th century, and then Rousseau, Jefferson, and Madison start using these terms quite regularly, and so it comes into the very political discourse that we now think of as American political discourse. Oops.
Go ahead.
Oh, yes. So let me just say one more thing about the checks. With Montesquieu, again, it's rarely pointed out that he does suggest a separation of powers for what he calls popular governments or democratic governments, but not for aristocracies and monarchies. He thinks in that case the aristocracy is restricted by their sense of honor, which of course doesn't tally very well with history. We know that these guys, were not restricting themselves at all. And so, but I think again, this shows that he didn't quite understand how this works. One last element in all this, of course, is public opinion, and is the need for feedback. If your government is based on the idea that government promotes the interests of the people by appointing experts into the EPA or other essential agencies, then one way to determine how well they perform, of course, is to have checks of the sort that Dr. Yang mentioned. The other is to have direct feedback from the people. In Imperial China, there were a number of channels for direct feedback to the government, so people could blow the whistle on a corrupt official, they could complain about a policy, and so on. And I gather that there is a similar system in China today called the Xinfangzhi, where online, people can go online, and again, they can point to problems in administration. And this is absolutely essential for any merit-based system to perform properly. And again, it's rooted, all of this is rooted in China's past, as Dr. Yang has already said. Yeah, that's my opening.
Thank you, Professor Powers. I've got a ton of questions for you, but what I do before each speaker is I'll ask you just one question, because I'm hoping that it will also prompt the next speaker to think about. Many of us have been brought up, particularly if we've been students of Western, we've been brought up in the Western education system, etc., which is, well benefited from, etc. But you've also shed light that many of those thoughts were borrowed from different parts of the world. And I know Professor Shankar is going to talk about it. But can I ask you just one point? It's widely understood, even among Asian scholars, etc., there's a whole concept of reasoning, that reasonable thought was a product of the Enlightenment. You almost debunked them. So I'm curious myself as to what's the foundation for you coming to that conclusion? Because I've heard many say that reasoning was one of the most profound sort of upsides of the Enlightenment. And I never believed it when I started to read, but you've actually said this now, so I thought whilst you're here, perhaps you could shed some light on how do you come to a conclusion? And I'm only going to give you a minute. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nair. That actually is a very helpful question. So the concept of reason, of course, is important in Plato and Aristotle, but they were speaking of God's reason, and the eternal reason, which shows itself in mathematics and physics and things like that. The early translations of the Confucian classics stressed reason a great deal, and it was clear to Europeans that this was not the Platonic reason. This was reasonable. And also, for the classical Greeks, ordinary people were not capable of thinking rationally, whereas for Confucius, every person has the capacity to acquire rational thinking. So this was fundamentally democratic. This is a very democratic idea. And it was picked up early on by people like Sir William Temple and other early Enlightenment figures as a very different notion of reason, where government should be reasonable in the sense that it promotes everybody's welfare, not just the welfare of a few people. And also, it was the secular aspect of it. It was considered reasonable in the early Enlightenment because it wasn't hobbled by various types of religious superstition.
Thank you, Professor Powers. We can come back to that. And also, I'd like to come back to the point you made about the notion of corruption and how it was viewed and captured and defined in China was also something that was understood more or helped an understanding in Europe. We focused a lot on meritocracy, but I also like Professor Powers, you to talk about ideas that took root and how the notion of what is right and wrong. In particular, Professor Powers, you talked about the issue about the institution being it's not the authority of the office. It's the authority of the office that is most important. And can you elaborate on that and what the roots of that are, and where else did it travel around the world? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a penetrating question, and it goes back to this this notion that God, which again Dr. Yang mentioned, that God plays a very small role in much of Chinese culture. So if you're not relying on an external force to certify what is what, how do you determine this? So the Chinese have this saying, you've probably heard it, 天人合一, that is to say, society is part of nature. And this you find, and so morality is also part of nature. And this is brilliantly formulated in the Song Dynasty. I've spent some time studying a kind of a crib, a kind of a textbook for preparing for the civil service exams, and written in the early 13th century, late 12th. And the author explains that if you look at nature, because there's no God, right? So if you look at nature, what is nature's tendency? It's the production of life, right? It's hard to deny that. That's what nature does. It produces life. And so therefore, the state and society must work together with nature in order to produce food for the people, in order to produce homes, bridges, and everything else. And his conception of government, which goes back to the Han Dynasty, I've written a book about that, is not that the government has a top-down relationship to the population. That's an aristocratic idea. The Chinese idea is that the two work together and as equals, actually. And this is how it's envisioned in pictures, that the people and the government are working together. Why? Because the members of government are drawn from the people, right? So if it's going to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, yes, indeed it is. This textbook says over and over, 皆为民, everything you do is for the people. And of course the officers are all drawn from the people. So yes, of course it is. So then how do you derive from this moral system, which clearly the production of life is a good thing? How do you recognize corruption? Well, it's very simple. When an officer's actions go contrary to nature by serving himself rather than the production of the people's lives, that is corruption. So here you have a moral system which has no God. It doesn't need God. It just starts with this idea that, look, we're part of nature. If we're going to survive, we have to work with nature. If there's no God, then no one has a right to claim they're more important than everybody else, right? And so we have to assume that everyone's life has to be included. And so this is what government does. Government works for that. And those officers who work for themselves rather than for the greater good, those people are by definition violating the public-private divide, and they're corrupting the system. I'll add that Thomas Jefferson arrived at similar ideas, quite possibly influenced by the Chinese text, because as I mentioned, he owned more than 100 of these policy documents, along with the Confucian texts and also a number of edicts in his library. And he also says that the land is given by God, he says, for the benefit of all men. And if one man's property rights extend so far as to deprive another man of a livelihood, then the state must step in and fix it one way or another. So this type of reasoning reminds me very much of what you'll read in Song Dynasty documents.
So, Professor, well, I think what you're saying is what some of us refer to as the Chinese system is essentially communitarian, that it is in the community as the starting point. And I think you referred to the work of the official is dedication to the public interest. So a quick question to you. There will be those listening to you and saying cynically, or perhaps, through their understanding, well, but China has had periods in its history where if this system did exist, or this was the civilizational core, well, how did that come about? So, very quickly, if you could just try and balance out that sort of remark, well, if it's so perfect, how come all that other stuff happened? I'm being a bit crass in my asking the question, but you see what I mean.
No, I understand. And that's a good example of, I think you've referred to as white privilege as one of the ways that white privilege is maintained. And of course, there's a confusion there. Jonathan Israel has talked about this. Sometimes people make the same complaint about Enlightenment thought. They say, well, gee, that sounds very good, but it's not always executed. But a thought can be useful. A political principle can be useful, even if it doesn't always work. But I think there's another problem with that question, and behind it is an understanding of culture that's based on a kind of a substance metaphor, where Chinese culture, everybody is made of the same substance. So if they did a good job in the Song Dynasty, how come they're not doing a good job here? And of course, it's not a substance, it's a collection of practices and ideas and institutions which sometimes work and sometimes don't. And one of the great insights of the Chinese tradition is that officials are fallible, and we saw that with Dr. Yang. They make mistakes. The emperor is fallible. Chinese emperors are constantly apologizing to the people for messing up. And everyone is fallible, which is why we need good checks built into the system. But even so, as Thomas Jefferson himself points out, even the best designed system doesn't work all the time.
Thank you, Professor. Very good. I'm fascinated by the young man who was elected the mayor of, is it New York?
Yeah.
Defined by many as a communist. That's so funny. But Professor Powers, I know you want to wade in on this, so let me invite you to comment on what you've heard so far. It's been a really interesting conversation. More questions coming in. But we got about 10 minutes left. Over to you, Professor Powers.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I also feel uncomfortable with the authoritarian moniker for China. There is an American philosopher and to me a sociologist also, Naomi Zak, who defines democracy as a government, very much as Dr. Ho just did, as a government that responds to the needs of the people. And her view is also very meritocratic and in many ways can mention, I don't know if she's read mention, she doesn't mention it, but nonetheless, this is her view. Also, I would observe, as I've spent many years studying aristocracies and aristocratic-like governments that are ruled by small numbers of people at the very top, a very small oligarchy. And these, even if they wanted to, typically they cannot serve the interests of a broad section of the population because they don't have the expertise. A handful of people who, in many cases are there precisely because they have no expertise other than gaining power, are not going to be investing in infrastructure, medical care, stimulating the economy, and all the things that the Chinese government does very well. These decisions can't possibly be made by just a tiny number of people at the very top. My understanding is that the Chinese government consults experts at all levels. They call it consultative. I'm not an expert in that, but I can see the results. I've been living in China for 3 years now, and I've been coming to China for 40 years, and I can tell you the improvements are really quite astounding. This is something that an authoritarian government could not accomplish. They simply don't have the means to do that. So we have to come up with a better term, I think.
Professor Martin Powers, the last word is yours.
All right, thank you. Yeah, to get back to basics, the 9th century historian Liu Zongyuan and the 20th century sociologist Charles Tilly both came to the conclusion that there are really only about 2 types of authority. One is personalized authority, which you find in aristocracies, fascist systems, and things like that. And the other is the one I mentioned, sort of the tally model, where authority has to be in the public interest and is held to a standard. I think as China comes back to these old discoveries, and of course, other cultures have embraced them also in the last couple of hundred years, I think that is offering a really important alternative at a time when many nations are going fascist, which is basically the personalization of authority in the interests of a few people rather than the larger community. Now, I don't want to make too sharp a binary, and there's no perfect solution on either side, but this is an issue I think it would benefit us to pay attention to.